Hi, I'm Dave Bundy, editor of the Lincoln Journal Star, and we're having an editorial board endorsement interview with Schuyler Windham, who's a legislative candidate in District 2. Schuyler, thank you for being with us today. First, I'd like to have Kent introduce himself, and then we'll get into the questions.
Hi, I'm Kent Walgamot, and I write about arts and entertainment, and I've been on the editorial board for about 12 years now.
All right, so Schuyler, the first question that we have for you, it doesn't seem like the most fun time in the world to be involved in politics, and yet you would like to be. So why do you want to be in the legislature, and what experiences and attributes do you have that qualify you for it?
Thank you, Dave. I got first interested in politics when I was in high school, actually. A young woman was running for office for Nebraska State Legislature, and she knocked on my door and my dad answered it. And I was kind of curious, like, who's at the door, because he was talking with her, asking her questions, which I think is a really good interaction to have in door knocking and going by and asking your neighbors what they're interested in. And she needed volunteers for her campaign, and that's where I first got involved. And I really enjoyed campaigning with her and volunteering on her campaign. I ended up going to UNL and Nebraska College of Law, graduated with my Juris Doctor in 2018. And I worked for a kind of policy law firm for a few years, practiced with them. And I also, when I was in law school, I worked with that same state senator. She had gotten elected, and I got to draft the sexual assault protection order with her. That's really where I started to realize, like, I like this work. I like using my skills to be able to craft legislation. I like listening to constituents come in and tell their stories, you know, what problems they have and how we can work together to solve those problems. I liked working with nonprofit coalitions. And so that's really where it got started. And then, as you mentioned, with the pandemic and the political climate as it is, it became ever more important to me to use my voice and use my skill set to help represent my neighbors. I think it's kind of unique to have an attorney who already has experience crafting legislation run for office. You don't see that every day. And to me, it's important because having worked in the unicameral, and that's why I want to run for the unicameral, is I already have experience with it. It's something that I'm very familiar with. I see every day that there are so many lobbyists and special interests and that kind of thing that often hand bills off to senators. And sometimes the senators get it, and other times they don't have the skills to read through and really comprehend what it is that they are doing. Like, I've seen that many times before in my work. And so it's important to me to run for this position because I know that I comprehend what is in a piece of legislation if somebody were to hand it to me. And additionally, I have the skills to craft my own legislation. I don't have to rely on other people to do that for me. And I think that's really important, especially in this political climate, to be able to directly represent your neighbors. If a constituent comes to you and says, hey, I have this problem, I can solve that for you directly. I don't need to go anywhere else. However, that being said, I am very much sensitive to all stakeholders and want that input from all people. So I have the ability to craft the legislation, and I will, just as I have before. And then you pull in stakeholders from all over. That's what I used to do at my old law firm policy job, is work with policy coalitions. So that's kind of a long story, is saying, like, why I want to run for Nebraska State Legislature, but it really is because I'm passionate about helping people and I have the skill set for the job.
All right. For the record, I think that's my second sneeze during a candidate interview. I really try to avoid that. All right. So, Schuyler, there's there's some tension. Nebraska is a state that local control has been a principle of government. There's some tension in the when it came to public health with the Lincoln Lancaster County Health Department and mask mandates in the state. There have been issues, with land use. Governor Ricketts and the legislature talked about banning perpetual conservation easements. You've got issues with the state Board of Education and sex education. What's your vision for local control? Is that versus state control?
Yeah, my primary concern is with the individual. I think the whole premise of our federal government and state government of the United States of America is individual liberties. That's what the Constitution is there to protect. You, with the paper, know very intimately and well that the First Amendment protects, for instance, your freedom of speech and press from government control and government overreach. So I'm very sensitive to individual liberties, and that's the most decentralized that you can get. So if there's any way for me at the state level to ensure that individuals can retain their liberties, both private property ownership, so your store should be able to choose who comes in and who comes out, because that's your private property. Just as you choose what articles that you publish, and I choose who comes in and out of my door. And then government not getting involved necessarily with people's individual freedoms. But I'm also very sensitive to local government control. And I think a lot of people understand that the closer that the local government is to the people, or the closer that government is to the people, and local government being the closest to the people, there's more trust. Usually there's more direct involvement. I would love to see people get more involved with school boards, because I feel like, unless it's something controversial, they don't show up, or, like other local governance. So I'm definitely sensitive, especially in rural areas. There's just a lot more representation at the local level that you don't get to always see at the state level, and definitely not at the federal level. So that's a kind of complicated way of saying I'm trying to balance all of these nuanced perspectives to make good decisions in the unicameral. And I'll just point out that I'm not going to necessarily stand by the governor 100% on anything and everything. We might align in some areas and we might not on others. But I'm not going to be privy to an executive agenda. So I'm going to use my skills as an individual legislator and working with my colleagues in the unicameral to make the best decisions for our constituents.
All right. Next question. We obviously have corrections issues in the state, the Department of Corrections. What would be your priorities? What plans would you have to address the problems in the corrections department?
That's a great question. So when I first worked for that state senator back in 2016, that was my first look into the crisis that was going on. And it really was a crisis. I don't know if you remember, in summer of 2016, we had a couple of inmates escape, and they were violent offenders. And there was kind of an emergency look at the unicameral to examine this question. And unfortunately, I don't think that has been answered all these years later. Like, there's not much that has been done, in my opinion, to remedy this. The governor's response is to take taxpayer money and just build a bigger prison with our overcapacity issue and trying to retain employees and prison guards for the prison. And I just don't see how that solves the root of the problem. It's very expensive. And to me, we are criminalizing way too many behaviors that the state has no business criminalizing. The big one that obviously a lot of people think about and comes to mind is marijuana. This is very contentious, but we know the science behind THC and CBD and some of these endocannabinoids, and it does not make sense to criminalize it. It doesn't make sense to throw people in prison for using and possessing a plant. I think that there's a big consensus here, especially on medical marijuana, but even just decriminalizing it completely. But there's a lot of things that are criminalized, other misdemeanors and that kind of thing, that are, they're misdemeanors, so you're not harming other people. It has to do with your personal conduct. There's thousands of misdemeanors. A lot of people don't even know most of what these are. So that's a great place to start in trying to make sure that people are not being overly incarcerated, because that doesn't help anybody, and nobody's able to work a job, provide for their family, get right with society if they're just constantly incarcerated. The other issue we have is like mandatory minimums, and they're on the periphery. We also have civil asset forfeiture in the criminal justice space that is a big issue. So there's a lot kind of bundled up with corrections and criminal justice reform, and it's one of my priorities to try to solve these problems. And I'll attack it any which way that I can. Another one would be the juvenile justice system, which I've had a personal experience with. My own sister was caught up in that, and they threatened to put her in a group home just for not attending school. And to me, that is a huge issue. Now, granted, that was a few years back, so maybe that's been reformed, but that was an issue for my family. And I think a lot of families have rubbed with the corrections and juvenile justice system just the wrong way, that they're definitely overreaching and trying to keep people in prison for a long time. And then it's no wonder that, nobody wants to work in an overcrowded prison. So I think if we get at the root here, we can solve a lot of those issues and focus our time, money, and attention on the most violent offenders and what we can do there.
All right. Another chronic issue seems to be tax reform. What's your vision for tax reform? And if it involves tax cuts, where does the money come from?
Right. So taxes hurt families the most. I know this from personal experience. My family was not wealthy by any means. We came from kind of a working class and middle class backgrounds. And these taxes are a heavy burden on Nebraska families. And I understand too that property taxes are a heavy burden on farmers, and that's why property tax reform was a really big issue the past couple of years. I also understand that when we cut taxes and those burdens on families and farmers, that also means that a lot of that money, as you mentioned, has to come from somewhere. We have to cut programs. I will tell you that there are a lot of what I refer to as pet projects that are passed in the unicameral every year. These can be tens of thousands of dollars, they can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it doesn't matter the political background of the senator, a lot of them bring these kind of interesting pet projects to the budget every year, which I think that's an easy place to cut from the budget. senators just want to look good for their constituents. And that's nice, but it's taking our tax money, our hard-earned money, and putting into programs that are not necessarily helping a lot of people. So my philosophy is really to make government as small as possible to give people, Nebraska families and farmers, people, small businesses, the most freedom that we can have. And the government is really there to protect those rights, the private property rights, and take other minute responsibilities in our interest. And I think that there's a lot of glut in the budget that is not necessarily helping anybody at all. So that would be my priority, is just making sure that the budget is not getting bigger with extras, and that we're focusing on what's really, really important, and making sure that Nebraska families are keeping as much of their money as possible, especially with inflation right now, especially post-pandemic. A lot of people, are underemployed or still not back to work necessarily. I think that some of our employment numbers are a little shaky considering how we measure those, the unemployment rate. And so that is just a big concern. I know a lot of people dropped out of the workforce to take care of family, of education and whatnot. So I think that there are a lot of struggling families right now, and taxation is the biggest burden on them financially, that I can solve at the state government level. I can't fix inflation that is being pushed at the federal level necessarily, but we can do what we can at the state level.
All right. Do you believe efforts to investigate the 2020 election in Nebraska are warranted? Do you support changing the state's election laws and procedures? And if so, how can those changes be made without suppressing the vote or disenfranchising anyone?
Yeah, this was a really contentious question with the 2020 election. And I'm sensitive to both spectrums of this argument, that one, we need to make sure that we have transparency around elections, and ensure that people are who they say they are when they are registering to vote and showing up to the polls. But on the other end, as you mentioned, we don't want to discourage people from voting. We don't want there to be additional barriers for our voters that it feels like they can't get to the polls. So I am definitely respectful of both of those interests. To me, I think if there are valid allegations in our system, we need to follow up with them from an objective standpoint. And whether that's auditing, investigating, etc. at the local level, any kind of allegations, then we do so. And that, I think, was done fairly well. And our system works at detecting whether there is fraud or not. And then on the other hand, if we see areas of improvement, we can look at that. I don't have a strong inclination one way or the other about fixing. In my personal experience, our election system here in Nebraska is really good, and it's fairly secure. I know my maybe not everybody does, but like I knew my election folks. When you go to cast your vote, they're family friends of my grandparents. They know who I am. I feel like there's still kind of that close knit feeling, but in some areas that might not be the case. But in my personal experience, I felt that the election system is pretty secure. But I'm just trying to balance all those different interests and that kind of thing. But I hope that was helpful.
It was. All right. Next question. Should the legislature scrap nonpartisanship? And if not, how do you make the legislature more nonpartisan than it is right now?
I like the unicameral the way it is now. Having worked in it and seen how the senators operate within the unicameral structure and that nonpartisan structure, senators have told me and staff have told me, and I kind of felt this way too when I was there, that it allows the senators to work with one another in unique ways that they're not necessarily able to in other states. And my husband lived in North Carolina. You know, other folks I know that have lived in other states have talked about how other state legislators kind of operate. And I'm actually really impressed with the way that our unicameral operates. Some senators, that it allows them more freedom to represent their constituents without outside pressures, whether that be political party pressures or the governor. As we know, the past few decades, the governor is just, both Governor Hyman and Governor Ricketts have been very much involved with the legislature and internal politics there, which personally I am not a fan of. And I've seen the way that the senators try to get around those kind of pressures. And the way that our system works right now is a way to alleviate that and allow senators to work with one another across party lines, where the focus is not political party. The focus is more seniority, and the focus is collaboration. And I think these two items are very important when we're talking about representing Nebraskans from all walks of life. Yeah, I think that sums it up. So I would not be in favor of making the unicameral bicameral or in making it partisan. I think the system that we have now is actually pretty unique and a good system.
All right. Well, I have one last question. Kent, you got a question?
Yeah, I got a couple. As you know from working there, most of the legislative real work gets done in committees. Have you given any thought to what committees you might want to be on if you would get elected?
Absolutely. I think initially my priorities would be to get on the Judiciary and the Business and Labor Committee. This is just based off of my personal priorities that I want to help small businesses, especially I'm from Lincoln, and Lincoln local businesses really suffered during the pandemic. So I have some ideas there to work to help our workforce and our local businesses. And then Judiciary, obviously from a criminal justice standpoint, that's where a lot of criminal justice bills are going to go through, is the Judiciary and anything else with the legal system. So that would be my initial priority. And then either later in the first term or in my second term, I would love to be on appropriations and work directly with the budget, which the senator that I worked with was on appropriations committee. So I know how much work is involved. She would bring like huge binders of all of the budget information back to the office, which I kind of like the idea of tediously going through a budget and looking at all of the bills and how that would impact the budget. So just to, like I said, try to alleviate that tax burden on Nebraskans.
And my second question has to do with water projects, and specifically about what your position would be on the canal to take water from Colorado and bring it into Nebraska out of the South Platte, and also on the big lake that is proposed for the plat up by Ashland?
That's a very good question. I don't have very much information on those two items at this point, so I would just need to gather more information about those projects to have an opinion on it. So I guess my answer is I don't know yet. But I am very sensitive to water rights, and obviously water is really important for both human consumption and for agriculture. So and I would be also worried about, wildlife and that kind of thing. And yeah, those are the kind of concerns that I have around that. So I'll definitely look into that and I can provide you follow-up information.
Okay.
All right, last question, and we're right at the 30 minutes, so we're well timed. What did we not ask you that you wish we would have?
I think more, I guess I would ask, you kind of asked why I wanted to run for legislature, which I could throw this in there too, but I guess more so my background, which I did put in there as well, but just, and a short answer would just be, aside from my educational background, it would be my personal background, and why I think it's important that young people like myself are running for office. I'm raising a family. I've got my nephew, my sister-in-law passed away early last year, and so now my husband and I are raising our teenage nephew, and so it's just that personal experience as like a young family in Nebraska, raising a kid, and the barriers that young Nebraskans are facing in particular too. And I think that's important to understand, for constituents and for voters to understand candidates' backgrounds.
All right, well, Schuyler, thank you very much for your time today. We will conclude this interview. And as I said, we will post this after we've interviewed all the candidates for District 2, and I wish you the best.
Thank you very much for interviewing me, and I hope you guys have a great day.
All right.
Bye.